Welcome to Come and See, your podcast for finding truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by All for Jesus Living Waters Ministry. With host and founder Richard Case and co-host and retreat leader Kathy Ricconi. Jesus reminds us to watch for the signs of his return. Today we will explore further what we are seeing in our times that line up with what signs he said would indicate the potential of the end and his return. We will also discuss the practical meaning of this as we watch and as a remnant prepare as he so leads. And now your host, Richard Case.
Well, good morning, Kathy. Here we are, End Times Friday. This is actually going to be aired the first Friday of March.
Wow.
So we're a little bit ahead of that. I think when this is aired, I think you'll be sitting in Spain, right?
Yes, I will be enjoying, at the beginning of March. At that point, I will be in Seville, Spain, I believe.
Nice.
So, yeah, super exciting. We are still looking forward to it. I was just booking tours today for a few different things.
It's going to be fun. We have been talking about the things happening in the world that are moving toward the one world government. And remember, and this is something to keep remembering because it's what then has to happen or how does it work. Mm-hmm. The one world government that is put in place is readily and willingly adopted, embraced mm-hmm. by the population of the world, except for the remnant, which we'll keep talking about. Because the only ones that don't are the ones that are truly following God, because they understand the spiritual dynamics of it,
right?
Not the natural dynamics, because the natural evidently comes with a solution, and it's going to be economic. Mm-hmm. That everybody says this is really a very positive thing for me personally, and it's not just, it's takeover or it's forced upon me or I'm losing something. They will see it as a gaining something, So there's a couple of things that are happening, and that certainly you've noticed just by observation, is that one, they just introduced a bill. This is just this week at the federal level. There has been bills introducced at city and state levels, and
but this is new that it's actually on a federal level being introduced.
This is all brand new to provide everybody born after 2005, mm-hmm. which would be this newest generation stepping into finishing college and then work. Mm-hmm. They would have the beginning of universal income. In other words, they don't have to get a job. They would just get this universal income that would be paid for, by the government, which to me is kind of funny a little bit. Is that, think of the millions and millions of people that would be, just per se.
Right.
And then they would be paid something, even if it's not a great deal to start with. Well, America.
Now, is it tied to a job? It is simply a stipend?
Just a stipend.
What is this?
No, it's just a stipend because you were born after 2005.
Of course.
And the funny thing that I always see is that, somebody has to pay for that.
Right.
And the government at the moment doesn't have the income, doesn't have the wherewithal to pay for that, mm-hmm. which means they have to borrow more. And already we're stressing the system to be able to pay for it. And what that does is add
more, or raise more taxes and everything else too.
Everything, yeah. But it raises debt, and then a proportion of the budget, federal budget, mm-hmm. has to be more and more and more has to be paid toward even the interest, not even the principal, but the interest on the debt, because the interest rates are rising because of inflation. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting situation where the mentality is, it doesn't matter, let's just do this, but the cost of it, and then the pressure that provides, but what it's saying is that younger generation will be in a position where they'll get used to this government, of course it'll be our government, then it'll translate to one world government, will provide you wherewithal, to live. And then you notice something about ownership, that the younger generation is struggling because of inflation, the cost of the housing that went way up, the cost of rent that went way up during COVID. Now when that was happening, by the way, remember the interest rates were basically at zero.
Right.
So you could get a loan for 2.5% or 3%. Well, now because of inflation, they pushed the prime rate up. So
and the housing prices are still staying very elevated at this point.
Well, they're not. And they're not certainly not coming down. And so the ability of somebody starting out that their income isn't at a level where they can afford to own something.
Right.
Now you and I were talking about this. You made a comment that therefore you saw that it might be easier downstream. What did you observe with that?
Yeah, my thinking was just, taking note of these guys are pretty discouraged. A lot of these young married, just newly married couples that we see that cannot afford to jump into the housing market. And there's nothing being built either in terms of starter homes. The closest thing being built, at least in the Northeast that I'm watching, I don't know where else that is, but in the Northeast, you're seeing a lot of 55 plus communities being built. Again, the size of house that would typically have been a starter home for these guys to step into, but at the cost of very much not a starter home and not even available to them because of age brackets. So you've got this whole group that is so discouraged about the housing market and are simply paying high rent that they really are kind of resigning themselves to, hey, we're not going to get to buy or own a house. And isn't it kind of interesting to think you've got a whole generation that if they have not been able to own something, the idea, I think, it desensitizes you. The idea of them coming in the Great Reset and saying, no one's going to own anything. Well, hey, that's not that big of a difference to me. I don't own anything now anyway.
Right. Yeah.
And so you have this whole younger generation that is really, that's kind of their reality already. So it's going to be much more readily accepted if things stay as they are.
Yep.
For them to say, hey, that's a good idea, that actually benefits me rather than hurts me.
Yeah, and I think that the harlot or the cabal that puts the beast in place, I think has a very thorough understanding of both the ability to change people's thoughts by repetition, as well as creating situations where it's better than, where they're coming from. So that one thing, we're saying to watch is the things that are spoken, the things that are issued, the things that are done that could recondition the population to something brand new that they hadn't necessarily had before. And so, typically in America, we were driven by capitalism and earning and then being responsible to go pay for things, including, simple things, which is, by the way, what caused the 2008 collapse is the banking system was built on a biblical principle of, in a sense, your ability to get through difficulty, so that the requirement for a down payment, for example, in a house, was 20%. And the 20% was to provide safety, interesting enough, for the bank, that if the market goes down and if you can't pay it, they could sell it and still keep whole. And then, by the way, it sorted out the ability of people to purchase things that they need to have the down payment in order to do it, which encourage savings and building up and of course families helping them do that. When they went to 100% and 110% loans, it was, well, I could buy it if the interest rate is low, I can pay for it at least for a while. But now it's creating a scenario where that gap of mine being able to, particularly a young couple, being able to buy something is now going to a place where I can't, and so they have to go rent. But then the rents are high.
Right.
And they're struggling
Crazy
with that.
high. Yeah.
And then there was just another, it was interesting that these articles were together. It was, universal income, and then there was another article that was 5 steps for the young generation to take so that they could move back home and try to negotiate basically a rules of engagement with your family so they don't try to control you. But you need them, to go live there. So it was really funny that, well, I guess I could live at home. And there's even, interesting enough, and this is funny, in the over 55 levels, they're building homes that have a separate little living space so that two families could live together, basically. So it's going to be interesting to see. So that's happening, and we'll monitor that. But keep watching for the ability and the movement of what's being done, what's being said, and the adoption of just that thought. Well, maybe that's not
right.
not
it's
such
that
a bad
you
thing.
used the word reconditioning, and I think that's an important thing to pay attention to. What
Yeah.
are we being reconditioned to?
Right. That's right. Well, we talked last time about the through a question that came up on the podcast of, hey, what prophecies haven't yet been fulfilled that need to be fulfilled for the end truly to come? And there's several. And it is a good question because by definition, they need to be fulfilled for the end truly to come. And so it's, what is still left, because we know the time is coming, but there's still things that have to happen to put that in place.
Right.
And so the question is, well, what needs to be put in place, and do we see any of that happening? So we talked last time about Jesus gave the signs. This is in Matthew 24. He talked about wars, rumors of wars, famine, pestilence, earthquakes. There's been an acceleration
Increase in frequency and intensity. Yeah.
That's all happening. There will be lawlessness. Well, that's happening. There will be a falling away. That's happening. And then he made a statement, is that, well, the gospel, the good news of Christ has to be preached throughout the world,
Right.
all the world. And I think you and I stated that there are, Bible societies and mission groups that are keeping track of it.
Right.
And they're basically saying we're pretty close.
We are very close, and actually getting increasingly, like, it's going faster than they realized it would go
Right.
to.
That's right. And that it's happening, and there should be a moment. Now, it doesn't mean that every single person is in a place where somebody is preaching to them, but the ability to deliver the message is being given,
Right.
and it looks like we're close to that. So that's an interesting thing to watch. Two, we talked about that in Revelation 18. At the end, it says that Babylon is going to be basically, destroyed, which means, and again, this is kind of an interesting way of looking at it, is, well, then Babylon had to be set up. And the one world government with the one world economy had to be set up, called Babylon. Well, it's not yet set up, but it is getting set up. And remember, think of when this happens, it's not an overnight thing that, like, well, gee, I didn't know that was even in play. That's a surprise. It won't be a surprise. It'll be methodically being put in place. Now, let me give you an example. We talk about World War II.
Right.
And Hitler. Now, because we weren't living then, when we read, it's like, I guess he just stepped into power and took over.
Right.
Well,
but it wasn't that way. There
no,
was a gradual progression there.
It was a gradual progression. By the way, interesting enough, it was driven primarily by economics. Remember the Great Depression. Remember, the Great Depression was worldwide.
Right.
29, the collapse of the market, and then the collapse of the economies. Out of that came Hitler in Germany, who said, economically, I can restore the economics. And this is funny, a little bit funny, because this is going to illustrate what's going to happen to believers at the end. But guess who was the biggest supporter of Hitler coming into power? The church.
I don't know. Oh, really?
The evangelical church.
Wow.
Because they said, hey, look at this guy has a solution to the economic problem, and we support that. And they actually were promoting it for him to get put in power. And then, of course, he was a great deceiver, so that as he got put in power, and he did it methodically over years and years and years, and gained power and gained ability, and he was a great orator, he became in power through the normal channels. But then when he got in power, he changed it all. And he set up his little mini one world government in Germany with, by the way, his objective was what? I want my system to operate worldwide.
Yeah.
And he had the power and the horsepower to do it. Of course, there were some flaws with that, with his technology, and he himself even had his own staff that looked at what was going on and say, I don't know, this doesn't seem right to us. And they had people inside that were against him, because it wasn't readily adopted. And remember, when he was going after one world government, he was going to do it by what? Force. I'm going to conquer you with military, and then once I do, you surrender. By the fact, when they started it, they started with Austria. You remember The Sound of Music, right?
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, it was a peaceful takeover, because he basically said, if you do it peacefully, I won't destroy you. And Austrians said, well, there's no way we can win against that, so I go ahead and
might as well.
we surrender. And we saw in that movie, Sound of Music, switch from being Austrian to be controlled by Germany. And you saw the red flags that were put out, because Germany took over the governance
without war.
Without war,
moving in.
And then they did the same thing with Poland, etc. But then the other countries like France and Spain and England said, well, we're going to fight you. And they did. And by the way, America was really like, that's your problem.
Staying out of it for a while.
This isn't us.
Our soil.
And then guess what? And this was looking at the world while Germany was doing that. Who else was looking at doing it? Japan.
Japan, yeah.
And they decided, well, we're going to surprise attack U.S. because they're not expecting it and they're not engaging.
Right.
And so Pearl Harbor happens on December 7th, 1941, and then we're drawn into the war, and because it's like, oh, wait a minute, it's both here and in Europe. I guess we need to go after both, and they did, and the U.S. power and might and the military genius is what stemmed everything, back, because it was by takeover, not by adoption. Well, in our case, in terms of the end times and the tribulation, it'll be universally accepted. But the thing to just observe is that it'll be being put in place piece by piece by piece, and you'll start to see it. And Babylon has to do it. And I think I mentioned that it's economic, and it's based on this trading system and the economic system. And guess what they call it? The people putting it in place is called Babylon. It's really interesting.
I think it's interesting too. We may have talked about this before on here, but I think it's worth mentioning again that, as you have shared many times before, you really feel, as you've prayed through and looked at it, that the economic side of it is going to be significant.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting to me that the number of times in the Bible that we are taught that you cannot serve God and money. And the number of things that, when they talk about idolatry, rooting back a lot, so often to money, and that the number one contender for our heart against God truly is money. And then in my mind, when you look at what's coming for end times, that is exactly that picture being set up. is this war actually between, are you loyal to God? Are you staying with what he is saying and walking with him and hearing his voice and trusting his provision, or are you trusting the economic system? And I think that is the question that will actually be facing every believer there. And when you're looking at, do we take the mark of the beast or do we not? Ultimately, it is that, do I trust God or do I idolize money?
That's correct. That's correct.
And I think that's why I think we see it so woven throughout scripture that we have to pay attention to what's going to be battling in our heart there as well.
Yep. And so there's the one world government has to be being set up in order to happen. So that prophecy hasn't yet happened, but it may be happening to be put in place. The other one was that Jerusalem, and this is Zechariah 12:9, that the world comes against Israel. And so two things about that. Jesus, I remember, discussed this already. Let's go there. This is back in Matthew 24. He talks about in Matthew 24, verse 32, the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you'll know that the summer is near. When you see all these things, it is near at the door. And remember, the disciples had said, when is this going to happen? He says, well, the signs are the beginning of birth pangs. He said, when this happens, you can start to realize it's getting closer and closer, and that's Israel returning and gaining strength as a nation. They are. And then in Zechariah 12:9, we read that the world comes against Israel.
Right. All of it, not
of it.
just portions of it. Yes.
Right. And right now, that's not a true statement. That prophecy hasn't been fulfilled yet because there are pieces like America. There is even some in England, in Europe, even the Middle East itself, Saudi Arabia, what we call the Sunnis, are actually favorable toward Israel.
Right.
And even having treaties with Israel. So they're not coming against them yet. So it'll be interesting to watch. Does that begin to shift?
Right. And now, does that have to happen before the tribulation ushers in?
It does not, but the signs of it does. Is that there have to be the beginning, because it happens fairly quickly during the tribulation. And is there an anti-Israel sentiment that's being developed?
Will be a good indication.
Will be an indicator, again, because it's not going to happen overnight, but is there a shift? Do we see a shift? And it seems like they're favorable at the moment. Does that start to shift? Because during the tribulation, that for sure shifts dramatically, and of course everybody comes against them. The next one is actually the beast itself and the formation of the beast. So go to Daniel. This is in chapter 7, and read verses 7 and 8. Daniel 7, 7 and 8.
Sure.
After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up from among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there, in this horn, were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words.
Okay. Daniel, as we've talked about before, describes, and of course it's described again in Revelation, the beast. The beast is created by the harlot. The beast is the one world system that establishes a one world governance over the world and a new economic process, one world economic process. So the beast is set up. And remember, the beast at first is a system, a one world government system, and is controlled, and Daniel says it, is controlled by 10 horns. The 10 horns are leaders that now establish the new governance of the one world system. and they are the deciding members of how it works. So it's not even at the moment when it starts. It is one world government, but it's not a dictatorship in
kind
the
of
form
by a group.
It's not a single person that's doing. Now it's implied that it's not elected. It's not elected. By the way, remember we talked about Elon Musk coming out and saying, "Hey, it's happening right before your very eyes, and we're not even going to participate in electing it. It's going to happen to us, but we're willing to accept it." So it's one world government, 10 horns. And as we're starting to understand this, up until really the last 5 years or so, the interpretation of that were 10 nations, or 10 governments that were joining together to form this. But it appears to me that it's not governmental at all. So it's not going to be America and England and they're all getting together. It's rather a corporate structure of some kind.
Which is an interesting thought, because when you look at corporations and how we have moved to worldwide international corporations cross political lines.
Correct.
And so their ability to have 10 influencers that can actually influence the world as a whole is greater actually than the politicians, I believe.
That's correct. And I mean, just think of, and I was actually part of one when I was with a Fortune 500 company as a senior executive. We had worldwide operations.
Right.
We thought global.
Right.
And we governed our piece of that globally ourselves. And yes, we had
So they're actually set up in a better position for this.
They're because that's how they think. And that's how they operate already. And interesting enough, when you look at all the governments of the world, including Russia, China, United States, Europe, every government per se is today broke. Now, by the way, there's one that isn't. Do you know who the one that isn't?
I don't.
Israel.
Oh, I did know that. I forgot.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
They're the ones. Their tiny little government are the ones that actually are not broke. They're being blessed and they know how to manage their money.
Do they carry debt to any other?
They have debt. Yeah, they carry debt, but they have just surplus. So they know how to deliver it. And every other nation is literally broke. And guess who isn't broke? Corporations.
Right.
And they have all the money. Trillions and trillions of dollars that they have available to them. And I believe, because of the way it's going to be structured, that the leaders of the beast are going to be benefited by the new structure. But there's 10 basically corporate structures, and then he says there's a little one. In other words, not one of the 10, but one that's in the group underneath it that steps up into leadership. 3 are eliminated, and he becomes one of the new, now the 8 that goes from 8 to 5 to 3 to 2 to 1, and he becomes the one standing, which is the beast, the Antichrist. But the beast has to be set in place. It's not today, but it's being put in place. We'll talk more about that next time. So as you look at that prophecy has yet to be fulfilled. And again, just like we were talking about with Hitler, it's not going to be an overnight thing. It'll start to be known piece by piece, and that has to be done for the tribulation to start. And so it's not yet in place, but it will be. And we'll see it. And by the way, I think we'll see the structures of it, which we'll talk actually next time a little bit about the WEF and the implication of that. So a big prophecy yet to be fulfilled is the beast itself. And we'll have to see it putting in place. So we'll talk more about this. We have more to say about all this because it's really fascinating to kind of line all these up and start looking at us saying, okay,
how close are we?
I can see that. And is anything happening? Yeah, it kind of is. So
excellent.
We'll pick it up and we'll keep answering this beautiful question, which is very important. What's left? and we're identifying them for you. So we'll get that next time.
Well, thank you so much, Rich, and thank you for joining us. If you have questions, send them in to questions@afjministry.com, and be sure to pass the podcast along to your friends who are asking these questions too and curious what's going on.
Yeah.
So have a great day. Thanks.
And by the way, the podcasts remain on the system. So
yes,
it's not like it's a live and gone. It's taped, presented, at a certain date, but then it's on the system and you can go back and look at it. And it's got a great way of categorizing it, so you can look it up by topic, etc. So
I don't know if you can look it up on the podcast by topic, but I know if you go to the YouTube channel, that there is a playlist, and you can go in there as an entire playlist that has from the beginning. We've been doing this 2 years now, but from the beginning, all of the end times videos are on there, as well as the other teachings that we've done. But you can hit the playlist.
And I'll find out about the podcast if there's ways to do that as well.
I don't know if you can do it on there or not, but that'd be great.
I think maybe, but we'll find out. Okay, we'll see you soon, Kathy, and we'll pick it up next week.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Okay, see you.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Come and See, your podcast for truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by All for Jesus Living Waters Ministry. Send us your questions and comments, and tune in tomorrow for more answers to your personal questions about living life in God's truth. Remember, God's will is best and none better. His truth brings peace in this world of chaos.